Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Albert Arena, Director of the Waltham Museum, a museum whose collection is on the history of Waltham. As part of our program, we have 16 historical slideshows on Waltham, and as you can see, the one we have for you today is the history of the Waltham Fire Department. Up until 1817, fires in Waltham were put out in only one way, by bucket brigades. Each resident was required to have a bucket, and when the alarm went off, the residents would gather together and near a source of water and pass the full buckets up the line until it was thrown on the fire and so forth. For the most part, this was unsuccessful and more homes were lost and saved. The first recorded fire in Waltham was in 1770. The first church at the corner of Lyman and Beaver Street was struck by lightning and started to catch fire. And a nearby farmer who was milking his cow took his bucket of milk, ran into the church, up to the belfry, and threw it on the fire and put the fire out. That's in the history books of Waltham. But as I said, up until 1817, this is the way they put out fires, by bucket brigades. But in 1817, the Boston Manufacturing Company acquired a hand pump vehicle from Hooneman Company in Boston. Now, the Boston Manufacturing Company had been in Waltham some 4 years now, and they were becoming very influential in Waltham. They put up a school in Waltham, they put up housing, they will eventually put up a meeting place in the town hall, and Waltham was becoming a mill town as opposed to being a farming town prior to 1813. So it was natural that they would acquire the first hand pump vehicle in the city, and in the town, and in effect, that was the beginning of the Waltham Fire Department in 1817. Most of the men who operated this vehicle worked at the cotton mill, and when the alarm went off, they'd grab this vehicle and bring it to a fire. Now here's what it looked like. Four-wheel vehicle pulled by men, not by horses. If you look at the left wheel, you can see a curved section. That's the suction hose, which they'll put into the river or stream, or later reservoirs, man-made reservoirs throughout the city. And approximately 10 men would get on either side, grab those rails, handrails, and take turns pumping up and down as the pump would pick up the water and discharge it through discharge hoses to the fire. And this is the way they put out fires until 1871. A Hooneman fire vehicle. They called it Waltham Engine Company No. 1. Although it wasn't really an engine, it was a pump. Now here we see another hand pump, a Neptune No. 3 they call this one, that vehicle right there. And all those men to the left will be pulling the vehicle to the fire. If you look closely, you can see ropes in their hand. The men closest to the vehicle will steer the vehicle, and those behind to the right will be handling the suction and discharge hoses once you get to the fire. Now this picture was taken in front of Rumford Hall, Waltham's old city hall, at the corner of Main and Elm Street. In 1871, there was no need for these vehicles anymore because they went to steam vehicles, but the old-time firemen just loved these vehicles, and they continued on with them for 40 years at annual events. They had this Veteran Firemen Association muster at Central Park every year. And first they'd have a big parade through town, they'd have a picnic, and then several groups of men would have contests at the turn of the century to see who could pull the vehicle the fastest and get it discharging water the fastest. They had a lot of fun at Central Park at the turn of the century with this Neptune No. 3 and other hand pump vehicles. Now in 1844, the town of Waltham officially took over the Waltham Engine Company. Actually, there were 2 or 3 other private organizations that had equipment that were fighting fires. There was the Independent Hose Company, number 1. There was a Hook and Ladder Company, number 1, and there was a Volunteer Boyden of another pumping engine, number 2. So in 1844, the town of Waltham organized all these groups under the beginning of the Waltham Fire Department as we know it today. And the first chief was Joshua Beard. And there were some prominent members on this fire department, such as Chauncey Newhall, who would later get Newhall School named after him. There was Ebenezer Hobbs, who would later become the superintendent of the Waltham cotton mill. But they kept the vehicles either at the cotton mill or else in front of Rumford Hall itself, and readily available so that when a fire occurred, they could get to them fast and pull them to the wherever the fire is. They did have some sheds, but it wasn't until 1867 that they put up the first fire station on Spruce Street. And I suspect they picked Spruce Street because it was between the Waltham Watch Company and the Waltham cotton mill. But here we are. This is Rumford Hall, the corner of Main and Elm, and some of the fire vehicles are in front of the hall. Now in 1871, 4 years after they put up the Spruce Street station, they acquired their first steam vehicle. Instead of using manpower as they had been doing since 1817, they will now use steam power. And the boiler, you can see the boiler clearly with the chimney. They'll generate steam there. The steam will go to 2 vertical steam pumps, and it would pump 400 gallons per minute to put out the fire. That large dome is the air chamber on the discharge side of the pump. It was all held up by a gooseneck frame structure on 4 wheels. The gooseneck was so that the front wheels could be turned more than 90 degrees, and was pulled by 2 horses, putting out 400 gallons per minute. But the men in this picture, the driver is James Wright. The engine man, the man who runs the boiler, is Howley. Marshall Parks was the fire chief at that time. He's the one leaning against the horse. And John Haynes is the assistant chief. He'll become the chief in 1875. He's in the rear. Now what they're towing there is the discharge hose in a separate trailer. Naturally, when they get to the fire, they'll take off the rear, that small trailer, and hook everything up and pump the water to put out the fire. This was a great improvement to the hand pumpers. And as I said, after these vehicles came into use, it was not necessary to use those hand pump vehicles any longer. Now here we see engine number 1, the one we just saw there. It was at the W.H. Nichols Museum for many years. You can see the 2 on either side of engine. You can see the discharge hose, the suction hoses, and the chimney of the boiler, of course, in the back of the vehicle. Once again, there's engine number 1 at the old W.H. Nichols Museum. It was such a popular vehicle in Waltham that the Cushing and White Weather Vane Company on Felton Street made a weather vane of engine number 1. And they did house this vehicle, by the way, at the Spruce Street fire station. In 1872, Boston had the Great Fire of Boston, and they asked the assistance of engine number 1 to help in putting out that fire. And this engine was brought to Boston by train, and it helped put out the fire. And after the fire chief of Boston wrote a thank you letter to the fire department of Waltham. And at the Waltham Museum, we have that letter on display, a copy of that letter on display. Later in 1906, this same vehicle would go to the Great Chelsea Fire. And at that time, it went in by 5 horses pulled it in, taking turns. And it helped put out the Great Chelsea Fire of 1906. But a very big change in the putting out fire system of Waltham took place in 1872 when they had built a pumping station and a hydrant system throughout Waltham. It replaced the 18 man-made reservoirs throughout Waltham as a source of water. Not only did the hydrants replace these man-made and other sources of water, but it provided them with 60 to 70 pounds pressure direct from the hydrant. In order to do that, this pumping station number 1 was built. First, the section on the left was built, and later the section on the right was built. And the pumps, the Worthington and the Westinghouse duplex pumps, would take a suction from a source, the Mount Wachusett reservoir, which later becomes the MDC reservoir in Quabbin, and pumps it up to a standpipe in the hills in the Brandeis area today. And the standpipe would gravitate down to all the hydrants in the town and give them 60 to 70 pounds pressure. In the emergency, this pump house could take a suction from the Charles River through 2 silos, filtered silos, underground. Now later on, they installed this bar pumping engine in that same building. It was a cross-compound coreless, and the pumps are connected to the head end of the pistons, and that would do the pumping of the water to the standpipes, and which would gravitate down to the hydrants throughout the town. Now here's a picture of Grand Street and Main Street, and approximately 100 years ago. And if you look closely on the right, I hope it shows you can see one of the old hydrants that provided the water for the fire department when a fire was about to occur or is occurring. Although they didn't need those hand pumpers anymore, they did need a number more hose wagons. So they acquired hose number 2, hose number 3, and hose number 4 wagons to go along with independent hose company number 1, and of course hook and ladder company number 1. And that's hose company. That's one of the hose companies right there. In 1876, they put up their second fire station at the corner of Prospect and Russell Street. And they now had 2 stations, one at Spruce Street and Prospect Street, one side of the river and one on the other side of the river. But in 1884, the town of Waltham becomes the city of Waltham, and the fire department is reorganized again. And the position of chief engineer, that fire chief, and number of deputy chief engineers, number of vehicles are all designated in the charter. But also this picture, by the way, is Central Square, Waltham in 1885. But also at that time, they're planning 2 new fire stations, one on Lexington Street to be put up in 1887, and one on Moody Street to be put up in 1890. And there we see the one on Lexington Street, put up in 1887. It's on a postcard. And you might notice above each door, those large doors, you'll see a white cement block. That is how you can distinguish this pumping station from the Moody Street pumping station, by that white cement block. Now the first vehicle they put in the Lexington Street station is chemical engine number 1. And they found out towards the turn of the century that there's a lot of oil fires and electrical fires, and the water source does not put out these fires. So they need other methods of putting out these oil and electric fires, and it's the chemical wagon. You see here, and they house this at the Lexington Street station. Also housed at the Lexington Street station is ladder truck number 1, which you see here. And of course there'll be a hose truck. Because as the buildings are getting higher, the Waltham Watch Company's putting up high buildings, the mill's putting up high buildings, they of course need these ladders to reach the peaks of the buildings. Still horse-drawn. Now in 1902, the Lexington Street Station gets a steam pumper drawn by 3 horses. And this one will put out 600 gallons per minute, as opposed to the engine we saw earlier pulled by 2 horses, which was put out 400 gallons per minute. And you can tell this is the Lexington Street Station by the white cement block. The discharge hose, the suction hoses are those stiff hoses along the this side of the steam engine, and the discharge hose is the bent hose connected between the 2 wheels. Now here we see that same vehicle again. They called it Eagle Steamer number 2 because it had an eagle mounted on the air dome on the discharge of the vertical pumps. It was very similar to the number 1. They were both made in Manchester, New Hampshire. They were Amoski engines, they called them, steam engines. And you might notice this number 2 had some lights, gasoline lights. The man on the right is the operator of the vehicle, and the one on the left we believe is Freeman Hogden, the chief engineer of the fire department in 1902. Now to go along with these steam vehicles, they need the men to operate them. So they have engine number 2. If you look on the side of this wagon, you can see engine number 2. These men would accompany steam engine number 2 to the fire to operate it, coming out of Lexington Street Station. There's Eagle Steamer number 2 again with 3 white horses. Now in 1937, Hollywood comes to, of course this vehicle had been retired by then, but Hollywood came to Waltham and asked Fire Chief Johnson if he would reenact this steam engine coming out of the Lexington Street Station for a movie they were making. And that's where these film clips came from. They're reenacting this 3-horse steam engine coming out of the Lexington Street Station, and other vehicles coming out of the Lexington Street Station, making a movie for Hollywood. It's Fire Chief Johnson at that time in 1937. But getting back to the olden days, there's Eagle Steamer number 2. It's at the corner of Alder and Moody Street. On the left, behind that fence, is where the South Middle School is today. The building in the center is where Kirsch Realty is, and over on the right is where Ritzy's Seafood is. And you can see the suction hose on the side, the operator of the engine and the driver of the wagon, the air chamber with the eagle above it, and the trolley tracks. You might notice the trolley tracks, which head for Newton. I don't know what they're doing. That's outside the Moody Street Station where steam engine number 1 is. I don't know what they're doing up there, but that's where this picture was taken. Now in 1890, they put up the Moody Street Station, which you see here. And by the way, the Spruce Street Station had a fire alarm system in it, a Gamewell fire alarm telegraph system. And so when the calls came in, they could set the alarm off, and this would speed up the process of putting out the fire. But when this station was built, the Gamewell fire alarm system was moved to this station right here, the Moody Street Station. And in the Moody Street Station, of course, was steam engine number 1, pulled by 2 horses, the suction hose and so forth. This picture was taken in front of the Beth Eden Church on Maple Street. Now the captain of that engine number 1 was Henry Smith. This is what he looked like. He would be on the force for 40 years. And his daughter, the late Mrs. Curtis Eastman, donated this picture to us with other fireman pictures many years ago. but that was Captain Henry Smith. Now here's engine number 1, which goes along with steam engine number 1, taking that picture in front of the Beth Eden Church on Maple Street. And the man way over on the right is Captain Henry Smith, we just saw in the last picture. Now ladder truck number 1 was over on Lexington Street, but ladder truck number 2 was at the Moody Street station. There's something unique about ladder truck number 2. Well, there it is again. In that it had a Babcock ladder on it. That's number 2 at the Moody Street station. And what the Babcock ladder was, right there, they acquired this in 1892, and here they're testing it out on Carter Street. And you can see the corner of Carter and Moody. See the old Waltham Depot on the right. But they're having a great time testing out this vertical Babcock ladder. Men are climbing all over it, pulling up the hoses. And for many years it will be housed out of the Moody Street station on ladder number 2. This hose number 3, now this one was operating out of the School Street Avenue, which was near, which will eventually become the Willow Street Fire Station. But there was a need for hose companies out in the Warrendale area. Now in 1906, Fire Chief George L. Johnson takes over, and he'll be the chief for some 31 years. If you ever think of the history of the Waltham Fire Department, Mr. Fireman is Chief George L. Johnson. He would relieve Freeman Hogden as the fire chief, and that's what he looked like. His first assistant chief was E.H. Bull, and the second assistant chief was G.H. Strauch. These men would never become chief because Chief Johnson was on for so long, 31 years. Now the first thing Chief Johnson wanted to do was to motorize the entire fire department, and the first vehicle he got in 1911 was a Rambler fire chief truck, combination fire chief truck and chemical truck, as you see here. That's Fire Chief Johnson, the passenger seat. That's Robert Johnson, not related to George Johnson, but the driver was Robert Johnson, and his grandson visited the Waltham Museum recently and told us about his grandfather. Actually, Paul Johnson, the son of Robert Johnson, was a great bowler in Waltham, one of the leading bowlers of Waltham during the 30s and 40s, but that's just a little side note. Now in 1915, they acquired another vehicle, engine number 2, and this would be housed at the Lexington Street station. This will replace Eagle Steamer number 2, because this vehicle will do all that is required of Eagle Steamer number 2 and engine wagon number 2. And as Chief Johnson continues to modernize and motorize the Waltham Fire Department, we'll be seeing this vehicle again in another shot. Now, March 1919, Chief Johnson has the Waltham Fire Department completely motorized. And they take this picture here on Carter Street with the Waltham Common in the background. It's one of those long pictures, too large to put on one slide, but we break it down in the next few shots. But we do have the large picture on display at the Waltham Museum, which identifies every member of this group. Now we'll start with, on the right side, is ladder number 1 out of Lexington Street, as you can see here. And to the left is engine number 2 we had seen earlier. You can see those 2 suction hoses that the men are standing on. That's the Lexington Street vehicles. Over on the right is ladder number 2. Now, the Babcock ladder is still there. They sort of improvised. They took the horse and wagon away and they replaced it with a truck, but they kept the trailer part of the old horse and wagon vehicle, and that's ladder number 2 from Moody Street. You can see the old Baptist church in the background, corner of Charles and Moody. Now there's engine number 1 out of Moody Street, and you might notice that in the passenger seat in the front is the captain, Henry Smith, we saw earlier. In the person way in the rear of that truck is William E. Hill. He has his hand going through the ladder. He would be killed in the 1927 fire in Waltham. 6 men were killed in the history of the Waltham Fire Department while on duty putting out fires, and William E. Hill was one of them. The first one was Gilson Farwell in 1853. Coincidentally, the man next to him, a little bit higher up, just to the right of that tree, was Arthur Bills. He would be killed in a fire in the 1930s. But that was the 2 main vehicles from the Moody Street station. Now this is a combination chemical and engine wagon, and the thing I want you to note is the man standing up in the center, the tall one. That's Frank Fleming. He would become one of the fire chiefs of Waltham in 1953. But there he is, March 1919, taking this picture with the entire Waltham Fire Department. This chemical engine number 1, this vehicle was improvised. Once they'd have a deputy or a chief's wagon, and once they get a more modern deputy or chief's wagon, they'd improvise it into either a chemical or a hose wagon. They did that several times. Now here's the Central Fire Station, where they're all completely motorized. And the vehicle way over on the right, there was a fire patrol wagon, and at that same location. And the purpose of the fire patrol wagon was to control the crowds whenever a fire occurred. After World War I, those members of the fire department who served in World War I took this picture. We believe it's in the Moody Street, Lexington Street area. But between World War I, they continued to constantly modernize their fire department. Here you see they have air tube tires now, as opposed to the hard rubber tires in the earlier vehicles. And up until World War II, they continued to modernize. Here's engine 2 with 3 suction hoses on the side. The discharge hoses are on the rear. It's getting close to World War II, and a lot of modernization took place. Usually it was an American LaFrance or a Mack truck that would replace each other, and the new engines would put out 1,000 gallons per minute as compared to the 600 gallons per minute put out by old Eagle Steamer number 2. But let's go back now and talk about some of the fires. We only talked about one fire so far, the first parish church in 1770, which was put out by a bucket of milk. But in 1835, the Massoyat house was put up at the corner of Massoyat Street and Main Street. And they had big plans for this house. It was going to be the central part of Waltham, the social center of Waltham. The stagecoaches were stopping here. Meetings were held here. It was a great big place. Unfortunately, in 1845, it caught fire and burnt to the ground. And being that it was quite a ways from Rumford Hall and the cotton mill, the hand pumpers at that time couldn't get there fast enough to put out the fire. And when they did get there, there was difficulty in getting the source of water, and also there was difficulty in putting out this fire as it got started real good. So the thing burned down, and the only thing remaining is this drawing by one person. Likewise, in Cedarwood, there was this Stratton House in Cedarwood, another place where the stagecoaches would stop as they go down a Boston Post Road. And it caught fire in 1896 and burnt for the same reason that the Mosoyet House burnt. Although they had steam engines at that time, there was difficulty in getting a source of water in that area. But we enter the 20th century, and this is the beautiful Moody Street Station as we enter the 20th century. They had the Lexington Street Station, they had the Spruce Street Station, the Prospect Street Station, and one out in School Street Avenue near the Willow Street area. And can you guess what the first fire was in the 20th century? It was the fire station itself on Moody Street. And on October 5th, 1900, this station caught fire. The straw in the rear, the straw used to feed the horses, the fire originated there, and the station was completely devastated. Some 5 or 6 horses were killed. No firemen were killed, although some were burnt as they slid down the pole to get away from the heat. You might notice ladder number 2 is out there in front of the fire station. There is the Moody Street Station again, 1900, right after the fire. They were forced to put the fire alarm system back to Spruce Street again until this building would be renewed in 1900. By 1901, it would be back in service again. Here it is back in service again with its ladder number 2, the one we saw in taking this picture on Carter Street with the entire fire department in 1919. That's the Moody Street Station. There it is, ready to leave the Moody Street Station with the entirely motorized fire department. And still, once again, there's the Moody Street Station next to the old Methodist Church. Well, the Methodist Church is still there also. But let's get back to some fires again. On June 27, 1912, the Waltham Boat and Canoe Club was located to the east of the Wood Avenue Bridge, and it had a devastating 3-alarm fire which wiped it out and also wiped out the New York Bottling Company, which was nearby. And this boathouse was never built. They put up a building to replace this building. It was the old Mica Company. Many of you might remember, right off Wood Avenue. But the curious thing about it, this was on a postcard, the burnt out Waltham Boat and Canoe Club, put on a postcard. Then on September 8, 1915, the Waltham Canoe Club, which was almost across the street on the Charles River, that had a 3-alarm fire, but they managed to save this building, and it was rebuilt, and would last until 1969, when it would have another fire, which will completely destroy it. It would be the last boathouse to burn in 1969. Over that chimney way over to the left is the Waltham Watch Company. On September 30th, 1915, at 40 Charles Street. There was an auto bus company, and 9 vehicles were burnt in a 3-alarm fire at that time. Now, this was a challenge for the fire department because they were dealing with gasoline tanks and compressed air in the air tires, and it was a difficult fire to put out at 40 Charles Street in 1915. Now, this is a moving projector, the first moving projector used at the Waltham Theatre in 1914, hand-crank moving projector. There's one problem with these moving projectors. They caused arcs and ignition, and they've been known to cause a lot of fires in many theaters throughout the United States, and it happened right here in Waltham in 1916. A moving projector like this caused a fire in a projection room at the Waltham Theatre in 1916. It was coincidentally they were showing a movie which was recently made, just made 3 weeks earlier, called The Romance of Waltham, and it was made right here in the streets of Waltham by a movie studio who was going around various towns and cities making movies, and it starred Esther Bird, who was Miss Waltham of 1916, and it showed only for 3 weeks before it was burned in the projection room at the Waltham Theatre. A very unfortunate thing, because it would be nice to see it today. Incidentally, Esther Bird Dolliver still resides at the Reservoir Nursing Home today. She's over 90 years old. The ice houses had fires. This is the Taunton Ice House. And on April 24th, 1925, this ice house burned to the ground. And it was a difficult fire because the ice hindered the firemen as they slipped, as they tried to get to the source of the fire. Of course, these ice houses had a large amount of straw in them to keep the ice from melting, and that's where the fires occurred, similar to the straw that caused the fire at the old Moody Street station. This is the First Congregational Church on Main Street, right across from the Waltham Public Library. And in 1925, they modernized this church. They removed that small steeple to the right and did some other changes. And they had a very fine church. Unfortunately, on October 5th, 1925, shortly after they remodeled it, it caught fire. And if it wasn't for the great work of the fire department, the complete church would have been burnt to the ground. But they managed to salvage it, and it was rebuilt in a devastating 3-alarm fire, 1925. The Davis and Farnham Foundry off of Sion Street in Waltham did foundry work there for many years. In 1930, it was used very little. It was sort of going out of business. So on July 24th, 1930, they had a great fire which required fire trucks from Watertown, Newton, Belmont, and so forth. Well, there's the Davis and Farnham Foundry right off of Sion Street, where Raytheon is today. There's the great fire, the Davis and Farnham Foundry fire. 2 100-long buildings were devastated, 1930. Then there was the first parish church at the corner of School and Church Street, one of the oldest churches still standing at that time, 1932. And on August 22nd, 1932, at 1:20 in the morning, this church had a devastating fire. And there it is, The entire roof collapsed and almost injured many firemen. These fires are all taking place under Chief George L. Johnson, who, as I said, was a fireman's fireman. The records show him stepping on nails and being overcome by smoke, and he was always right in the middle of all these fires. But this fire at the First Parish Church, the clock kept running until 1:21 till it clashed to the ground along with the bell that was in the church. And the fire was eventually extinguished, and the building was renewed, and the still First Parish Church is still there at the corner of School and Church Street. Then there was the Waldorf Theater. This is the Waldorf Theater, a view of the stage from the auditorium. And the Waldorf Theater, of course, was on Elm Street. It was the old music hall theater, scenic theater, and park theater. Incidentally, in the same building, which had a 3-alarm fire on September 8, 1932, but in that building was the Fleming family. Frank Fleming's mother lived there, and his family, and he not only warned his mother to get out of the fire, but he participated in putting out the fire at the Waldorf Theater in 1932. At that time, it was not being used that much because the movie theaters were moving into Waltham, and this was an old vaudeville and theatrical theater. In 1932, the New Hall School on Prospect Street, November 11th, that had a fire, and it just so happens my older brother was going to school and he came home. I was too young to remember, but he always tells about how happy he was that he had to come home from school because the school had a fire in it. But they rebuilt it and used it as a school for many years until it was made into senior citizen housing about 10 years ago. Like the Taunton Pond Ice House Company fire, the Peterson's Ice Company had a fire in 1934, and that company would eventually be destroyed. Here we see the men cut the ice and shooting it up for Peterson's Ice House. In 1933, this was Central Square, Waltham, Mercantile Building on the left, Blackstone's on the right. And that evening, at the Mercantile Building, a tremendous fire took place. Didn't quite destroy the building, they rebuilt it, but the Mercantile Building had a terrible fire that evening in 1933. One of Fire Chief Johnson's last fires was the old Middlesex College, which of course is Brandeis today. And the fire started in the basement, and it was difficult to get at. One of the reasons it was difficult to fight was the low water pressure, because Brandeis is up in a hill, well, the Middlesex College is up in a hill, and the water pressure was insufficient. You want to remember it's coming from a standpipe in the same general area. The water pressure can't go down and come back up again. So it's necessary to use the engines, trucks, to boost the pressure to put out the fire at the Middlesex College on February 19, 1936. And incidentally, Henry Smith was still on the force, and Henry Smith fell over and was knocked out when he hit his head in this fire. And he retired shortly after this Middlesex College fire. Also, there were 2 pedigree greyhound dogs, for some reason, in the basement of this building when the fire occurred. And they thought the dogs would be killed, but they found them in very good health, and they were saved from this fire. That was the old Middlesex College fire, February 19, 1936. Here we see it again, Middlesex College, now Brandeis. It's a National Historical Site. Quite a fine building. Now, in 1939, Fire Chief Johnson retires, and the Waltham Fire Department gives him a radio, a Zenith radio, as his retirement gift. And at the Waltham Museum now, you can see this radio, a beautiful Zenith radio, with a nameplate on top saying, to Fire Chief George L. Johnson on his retirement from the Waltham Fire Department. Johnson would go on to live till 1944 when he passed away, but like I said, he was a fireman's fireman for many, many years. Now, during World War II, there weren't many fires. People were concentrating on the war effort. But on December 21st, 1946, about a year and a half after the war ended, the Ventura block had a devastating three-alarm fire. But this is not the Ventura block. This is the Make-A-Lot Company explosion of March 6, 1948. The Make-A-Lot was where the Brandeis Roberts train station is, right across on the north side of the tracks. It was a plastic plant, and it blew up at 11:08 on March 6, 1948. 5 men were killed in the explosion, and many, many were injured, including my neighbor, Amos Biddy, a gentleman who came up from the south, raised a fine family. He was completely burned all over his face, and he was a fine gentleman who passed away about several years ago in the 70s. But we have another shot of the Make-A-Lot explosion right there. I remember I heard it, I was on the Moody Street Bridge, and coming from Brentwood Bowling Alleys when I heard this tremendous explosion. There was a first national supermarket store fire in October 26, 1948, but the one you see here is the Middlesex Hotel fire on January 16, 1949. The new fire chief is Bertram Neal. He'll be fire chief till 1950 when he's be relieved by his brother Ernest Neal. But that's the front of the Middlesex Hotel and its adjacent buildings. And that's the back as they fight this fire at the Middlesex Hotel, January 16, 1949. On March 1st, 1950, Bertram Neal retires and his brother Ernest Neal takes his place. And they have this banquet for him at the Moody Street Fire Station. And most of these men have been identified. It's been now over 40 years since this picture was taken, and most of these men have been identified. Now, this is an old picture of Barker Lumber, but on January 24th, 1954, Barker Lumber had a 3-alarm fire. Prior to Barker Lumber having a fire, Jordan's Furniture had a fire on September 25th, 1951. Following the Barker Lumber fire, there was a Downing wholesale fire, 3-alarm fire, February 21st, 1955. A Yetton storage fire, February 4th, 1959. And then the fire that most people keep asking about was the Nuttings fire. Now, this is the beautiful Nuttings Ballroom off Prospect Street, popular place for dancing and the big bands. We have several shots of it. That's the entrance to Mount Feet Cemetery on the right. The Nuttings Ballroom and the Waltham Watch Company over on the right. But later in life, in the 60s, it becomes first it was a roller skating rink after World War II. Then it becomes a storage house for Park Snows. Here's one of the last shots taken of it. You can see the Reese Corporation is across the street where Peterson Ice House used to be, and at the Prospect Street Bridge. View of Waltham. But on June 18th, 1961, Nuttings burns. And it burns and burns until it's right to the water level. And it was a sad thing. People hated to see it go. But you can still see the pilings sticking out of the water near the Prospect Street Bridge. That was June 18, 1961. Coincidentally, another similar spot, although it was in Newton, had a fire in 1964, Nonbigger Park. And first Nuttings went, and then Nonbigger Park went 3 years later. But getting back to Waltham, there was the big bleachery fire. Here we see an early picture of the bleachery. That's where Zayres is today. Bleachery, of course, bleached and dyed cloth for the textile industry. You might notice the Governor Gore estate way over on the right. Now, in the 50s, the late 40s and 50s, it was owned by Raytheon Company. And as this news item says, the old bleachery was scheduled to fall under the wrecking ball. The sign in the building says Waltham Bleachery and Dye Works, established 1920. Now, on February 4th, 1965, by the way, Ed Clunan is now the chief. After Ernest Neal, there was Frank Fleming, John Steed, Ed Clunan, Joe Steed, and presently we have Fire Chief Joe Zamuto. But this was a real tough fire, 3-alarm fire, on February 4th, 1965, the old bleachery. Now this is Fry Roofing. This is, this is Furman Lumber on Linden Street, March 19th, 1969. And the two firemen you see there are Richard Cotton on the left and Robert Cosgrove on the right. Shows you the hazardous conditions these firemen have to work under in these number of fires. As I mentioned earlier, the last boathouse to burn in 1969, September 21st, 1969, was the Waltham Canoe Club, as you see on the right. Arnold's to the left of it burnt down in 1930. But that was the last boathouse to go. The Fry Roofing Company had a fire on February 19, 1970. But the worst fire in Waltham's history was this building right here. The General Battery Company, they call it. But we know it more as the old Mets building on Rumford Avenue. And on March 18, 1970, it burnt, and it took over 24 hours to put this fire out. Trucks came from all cities and towns, including Boston. 3 came from Boston, and it burned for over 24 hours. Of course, it was the old Mets plant, but they came from Newton, Watertown, and there was nothing they could do about it. Just the batteries were burning inside. It was just too much, and the building was old, had a lot of oil and grease in it. Not much they could do about it. There it goes. There's a $2 million loss at that time in 1970, which was quite a bit. There's the fighting the fire here. Now this is not the General Battery fire. This is the Warren Estate fire on February 28, 1973. Although we don't have pictures of them, I want to mention a few more. On June 10, 1972, there was the Polaroid fire, 2-alarmer. The Middlesex Railway, the old bus barn, burnt on February 15, 1973. At the corner of Hall and Cushing, there was a 3-alarm fire February 27, 1973. And like I say, this was the Warren Estate, the Cornelia Warren Estate off Beaver Street, February 28, 1973. After this fire, there was the O'Donnell Building, July 30th, 1974. And then on April 26, 1975, there was the Storer Estate. Both the Warren and the Storer Estate were out in the wooded area, and they were no danger to adjacent buildings, or they were danger to the forest getting caught on fire. Here they're still fighting the Storer Estate fire. This is the All-American Laundry fire, and some other fires that weren't really large ones, but we have information on. The All-American Laundry fire on Rumford Avenue, which was near General Battery. You know, we're overlooking many, many fires. These are mostly the major fires we've been talking about. Now here's a fire on Charles Street, 162 Charles Street, which we took with a camera as we approached it. It symbolizes the many, many house fires that have taken place over all these many years, which are not really brought to your attention at this time. But you see the firemen going up the ladder on the left. And there he is on the roof, putting out this fire. Although it was a terrible fire, we managed to salvage the building, and it's a fine single-family home today. That was in 1975. Also at that time, there was a fire at 400 Totten Pond Road, one of those modern brick buildings. Got fire on April 10th, 1976. This fire was a pool room on Charles Street. They couldn't save the building. It's torn down, but old Bomber's pool room was there. And there's a vacant lot there today. I believe it's 95 Charles Street. This was the old American Legion home on Weston Street. After they moved to Waverly Oaks Road, this building was vacant, and it had caught fire. Now we're missing a lot of fires in the 80s and late 70s, but here's one that had several times been set on fire by vandals. The trestles going across the Charles. And after they put it, this is what they look like after the fire, all charred trestle boards near the cotton mill. Then one of the last fires we'll be talking about is at the cotton mill itself. When they were tearing down some buildings for Landry Park, sections of the building caught fire. Just strange that here was the same general area in 1817. The Waltham Fire Department, for the most part, was starting up, and here we're going to leave it with a fire in that same general location. Now, like 1919, they were proud of their fleet. In 1917, they were also proud of their fire department. And that's the chief's car in front with 3 deputy cars and the entire Waltham Fire Department in 1971. As one of the deputy cars out of the new Lexington Street station. In 1964, they put up the Rhodes Municipal Station where they housed the new fire department and the new police department. Now this engine number 1 out of Moody Street. You remember old steam engine number 1? Here's Waltham engine number 1 now out of the Moody Street station. This concludes the history of the Waltham Fire Department. I'd like to thank Rudy Curry, who donated his entire collection of newspapers to us. And I'd like to thank Mike Druckman, who wrote the history of the Waltham Fire Department, and to Pat Arena, who makes these title slides for our shows.